Let me introduce myself. I'm Vidita Vaidya. I'm a neurobiologist here at TIFR. I also am the convener of the Art and Archives Committee of TIFR, which is in some ways our outward-facing arm for the archival collection that we are the custodians of, but also our amazing art collection, some of which you will get a glimpse of right outside the Homi Bhabha Auditorium. So it's our pleasure to be working with Avid Learning and Asad Lalji's team, and I will now hand over to our director, Jairam Chengalur, who will tell you a little bit about TIFR and also a little bit about our Art and Archives collection.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Vaidya, and welcome to TIFR. Since some of you may not be familiar with the Institute, I thought maybe a brief introduction would be in order. TIFR was founded just prior to independence by Dr. Homi Bhabha with the vision of setting up an Indian institute that would do world-class science. And I think thanks to his drive and his vision, and of course the continuing dedication of all of our staff, past and present, I think it would be fair to say that TIFR remains a premier research institute with a very, very high international reputation. TIFR scientists have played a major role in initiating many nation-building initiatives, including the Atomic Energy Program, the Space Program, digital computing, as well as computer science in this country. As time passed, this campus became too small to hold all of TIFR's activities, and today TIFR has grown to 7 campuses spread across the country, doing cutting-edge fundamental research in a huge range of fields, including physics, chemistry, mathematics, computer science, astronomy, science education, and a topic closer to today's panel discussion, biology. Ecology and climate sciences, which of course are still closer to today's panel discussion, are also areas where TIFR is quite active. And as you all know, even in those parts of the country which are not close to the coast, oceanic conditions are very important because they play an important role, a critical role, in setting the monsoon patterns. The TIFR balloon facility, which is located far inland in Hyderabad, is one of the few places in the world which makes balloons which can carry heavy instrumentation all the way up to a height of 30 kilometers, that is the stratosphere. Our balloon facility supports several earth science-related programs, including a unique long-term program to gather data that's important for understanding the monsoon system. I'm also very glad that we have with us today Professor Mahendra Sonavne from the Department of Biological Sciences, who specializes in the study of fish and who will be moderating today's panel discussion. As Professor Vaidya said, we also have a very long tradition of engaging with the public, both in the form of public lectures on cutting-edge topics by eminent scientists, including Nobel laureates, as well as science outreach talks, which we call Chai and Why. So this is a series which is held every alternate Sunday at the Prithvi Theatre in Juhu and Ruparel College. And I think it's been running without pause now for close to 15 years, and it's probably one of the longest standing public outreach programs in the country. Thank you. If you'd like to know more about these programs as well as their schedule, please check out our webpage and social media feeds. There are also, of course, many other ways in which we could engage with the public. Vidita has already mentioned one of those, that is through our art collection. Thanks to Dr. Bhabha's interests in the art as well as the interest in art by his successors, TIFR has one of the finest collections of modern art in India, and we do organize from time to time art walks so that the public can actually sort of see these artworks. So again, please check out our social media feeds if you'd like to be part of the next art walk. And there are still newer initiatives which we are taking because we've been feeling for some time that it would be good to explore additional avenues for connecting with the cultural landscape of Mumbai. And today's program is part of that initiative where we are partnering with Avid Learning to have a panel discussion. This is the second of the series, as Vidita mentioned. Today's topic is Living Seas Towards a Sustainable Marine Future. And this, of course, is a topic not just of scientific interest, but one which has multiple dimensions, as well as major societal impact. And a proper understanding of this requires one to have several different, partly overlapping facets that you would need to take a look at, and that indeed is what Avid Learning and TIFR is happy to bring to you today. So it's very fitting that we're going to hear today from a panel of very distinguished speakers who will each be bringing their specific expertise to this discussion. We are delighted to have partnered with Avid Learning and NGMA to put together today's program, and I'm sure you'll find it fascinating and informative. Welcome again to TIFR and today's panel discussion. I'll hand over now to Avid Learning and Asad to please take the program forward.
My name is Asad Lalji. I'm the CEO of Avid Learning. Thank you to Professor Chengaluru and Professor Vaidya for those kind words, your warm welcome. It's always such a delight to be back at the TIFR in this wonderful auditorium. So welcome to Living Seas Towards a Sustainable Marine Future. As mentioned, this is our second collaboration with TIFR under the Sustainability Now banner, our flagship public engagement series that brings together science, art, policy, and community. Tonight's program is also the inaugural event leading up to Mumbai Climate Week, presented in collaboration with the National Gallery of Modern Art, the NGMA, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and Project Mumbai in partnership with the Government of Maharashtra's Department of Environment and Climate Change and the BMC. As many of you know, the Mumbai Climate Week is scheduled from February 17th to the 19th, 2026, marks India's first dedicated platform to accelerate climate action, empowering Mumbai, India, and the Global South to shape transformative citizen-driven solutions. Today's conversation contributes meaningfully to that collective mission. Last time we explored how climate change and biodiversity loss are reshaping our land. Tonight we shift our gaze seawards to the oceans, coastlines, and communities that are just as vital to our survival and just as vulnerable. And there is no better city to host this dialogue than Mumbai, a coastal metropolis cradled by the Arabian Sea. Mumbai's relationship with water defines its geography, culture, and economy. Yet our seas are under unprecedented stress: plastic pollution, rising water temperatures, overfishing, eroding shorelines are some of the major issues. At the same time, oceans offer us tremendous hope. According to a 2025 KPMG report, India's blue economy contributes to about 4% of the national GDP and employs 30 million people and aims to be a 1 trillion economy by 2030. And yet the future of oceans depends not on scale alone, but the choices we make as consumers, policymakers, scientists, and citizens. And this brings me to the task at hand, Living Seas Towards a Sustainable Marine Future. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for the evening. Consultant, State Climate Action Cell and Climate Group, Sarita Fernandez. Director, Coastal Conservation Foundation, Shaunak Modi. Fisherman and founder, Blue Catch, Ganesh Nakwa. And our moderator for the evening, co-chairperson, Department of Biological Science, TIFR, Professor Mahendra Sonwanvi. Look forward to an enriching conversation, and thank you all for being here, and I'm sure this is going to be a riveting one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Asad, for the introduction. Thank you, Jairam, for pointing out that I'm a fish person. That probably makes me more legitimate person to moderate this discussion. But let me start by welcoming the audience today here. Thank you for joining us. In today's session, we will be discussing about living oceans and we'll mostly cover the engagement of the community, of course, the conservation, biodiversity, and the policies. And while we are largely going to cover the regional or local aspects, before we dive into those details, we will also cover some of the broader questions that many of us would have. And in that context, I must say I joined this discussion as a layperson, although I'm working on fish. I haven't thought about marine diversity so far. But the reason that also kind of made me join this, and also, of course, in addition to Vidita's nudge, we realized two things. I mean, I realized two things. One is that the ocean is just next door, and we need to know about it. That's one thing. The other thing is that we have been thinking about, as a department, recruiting in this particular area. And when you do that, you need to be aware of the issues about marine diversity. And I think this was the occasion, and it was, for me, it will be a great learning experience, learning from all these experts, the panel of experts who are sitting here. So with that, I will start today's discussion. And as I said, we will start with some real broader questions that I have as a lay person. And the first question is, when you say living seas or living oceans, what it means is that there must be dying seas and dead seas. And so the question is, what is it? What do you mean when you say a living ocean? And maybe, Shaunak, you can start with that because of your expertise in biodiversity, and you have been thinking about these issues for quite some time now. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. You've said it. There are dying seas and there are dead seas. Unfortunately, while ours is living, it's not really a thriving sea here. And I think what it means is when there is enough that the sea has to offer us as humans who live next to it and the inhabitants that live within the sea. That's what a living sea is to me. Of course, there are degrees to it, but at the very core, that it should not just be a resource that we extract from, but there should be enough for everybody.
But what are the early indications of the that the life in general is getting compromised in an ocean or in a sea? Are there early indications which can tell us that there is we need to worry about, their interventions are required? What are those early indications?
Yeah. I think one of the most common ways to tell this, that there is a problem, is when, and of course Ganesh is a much better person to answer this than I am, but when the fishers who fish close to the shore get a smaller and smaller catch, I think that is the biggest indication that something is not correct. Something is going wrong. To give you an example, we often do our work at Girgaon Chowpatty, and we've seen fishers who fish within the back bay, after 4 hours of gill netting, come back with 3 fish. And I mean 3 fish, not 3 individuals. And when you see that play out over and over again in different parts of the city, different parts of the coastline, when I visited different fishing villages across Maharashtra a couple of years back, I saw this story play out even there. And something's drastically wrong when you see this happening over such a large area. And I think for us, that's one of the easiest ways to tell something's not right.
Great. Ganesh, would you like to add something?
Yeah. Of course, living sea is also God for us. And that is why, every, after monsoon when we go to fishing, we pray to the ocean, for a good catch, safety of fishermen, and, healthy lifestyle as well. That is the basic we ask from the living, because that gives us everything. Before the trade was there, the entire fish catching was for the barter system. That's what I've learned from my grandfather. And just to add what just Shaunak said, catching 3 fish in a Buck Bay and a Bombay Creek, that's what I grew up listening to, when my grandfather used to catch fish in 40s and 50s. And, one catch of bagnet, that is the most traditional form of fishing practice which has been done across the Mumbai coast and Thane, Dharamtar, name it, Malad and Mahi, Worli area. These are all fixed bag nets, and the current goes in and the fish goes in. And in early 30s and 40s, you go one tide and you come back full boat of, prawns and pomfret. That's the story we used to hear. And slowly after independence and industrialization, the catch started decline. Of course, there are major factors. The city started growing and all this, the pollution and the sewage. And that's why, the fishermen started going deeper and deeper into the ocean. And of course, there are problems there as well now.
Yeah, thanks. Since you mentioned the factors, Sarita, maybe I'll come to you. What are the factors that affect the the biodiversity, so to say, in seas. I mean, these, I'm sure, are global factors and local factors. And if you can tell us about both global as well as local, that would be really nice.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. So, just something that Shaunak and Ganesh said, I was remembering my grandmother. So she was the first generation of the Goan migrants that had come to Mumbai in the 50s. And there was a story that every Sunday she would take her 5 daughters to Marve Beach and they would go for a swim there, like a whole day picnic. And I was like, you cannot swim in Marve Beach. It's so, I fill in the blanks. Like, you cannot swim there. And just to understand that just from there to my generation that we cannot even access the sea, right, for like a swim. And then you go towards fishing as a second indicator is an indicator that something has gone fairly wrong. In terms of what are the factors contributing to it, yes, I think policy and governance has a huge role to play in this, especially when policy is designed, say, for one sector of this blue economy and this ocean economy that we know, or a few sectors, and leaves out the other sectors that are using the same commons. I think globally also these narratives are very siloized, right? When we speak about fishing, we only speak about the fisheries part. When we speak about biodiversity, we speak only about marine protected areas, which excludes fishers. When we speak about economy, we speak about deep sea mining. All these conversations are happening on the same commons of the same resources, but nobody is talking to each other. Nobody even wants to take an interest in knowing that, okay, how am I going to affect you and how are you going to affect me? So I think the siloization, if that's a word just to coin here, of the ocean and specifically the governance models of the ocean, in my view, is one of the major contributing factors locally, nationally, and globally.
Thank you for that answer. With the, rather broader aspect of biodiversity in general is also that, seas largely act as sink, heat sink, as well as carbon sink. And from that perspective, so while climate affects the ocean in turn is also going to affect the climate. So how does biodiversity actually play a role in, in oceans, role as a heat sink or a carbon sink? Your thoughts? Yeah.
I'm so happy that you asked this, and I'm so happy that I'm here. I can say this in public. RA is not Mumbai's last green lung. We have the sea. Okay, half of the carbon that's in and around Mumbai is also absorbed by the sea, and it's something that we forget. I'm not saying that forests aren't important, but the sea is equally important. So if you look at the coastal waters, even before we reach the water, just at the interface of land and sea is the intertidal zone. And in that intertidal zone, we have 3 types of habitats. We have muddy shores and mangroves. We have sandy beaches. They are the most famous and the most known shores. And we have rocky shores. And on those rocky shores, we have millions and millions of oysters. So the ecosystem services that the ocean provides starts there. It starts on land and then heads in. Those oysters that we have, they are fantastic filter feeders. They help clean the water. The algae that's there starts taking in all the carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. And I'm talking about the green algae that's on the upper reaches of the shore. And then as we keep going further and further in, there are coral reefs that help support human societies. There are mangroves that help us from storm surges. There are mangroves which are also fantastic carbon sinks. So when you talk about what services biodiversity plays, there are lots. It would be too complex for me to get into here, but these are just some of the representations that I can think of right now.
Thanks. So since you mentioned mangroves, Susarita, a question for you, because you have been in this domain of coastal regulation zone and the compliance. So any thoughts on mangroves and mangroves preservation? Are there policies?
I mean, it's not doing a great job, but there are policies in place, of course. And these policies, again, are born not from, huge scientists or experts, but citizen scientists, and citizen scientists who probably went and said that, oh, we are noticing that during the tsunami or a flood event in different parts of the coast, communities staying close to the mangroves are not that affected. And, there's this confidence of like survival if you're living around mangrove buffer zones. So the transition from, say, high court orders, from which this whole chapter started on like protection of mangroves, it started in Mumbai, transitioned into the coastal regulation zone also in an amendment. And now we have the, buffer zone of 500 meters and 1,000 meters. Specifically for mangroves, it's different. So there are protection for mangroves, but also in a city like Mumbai, where space is, in scarcity, you look at a mangrove, like even from a very governance, a very policy perspective, when you have so much of informal housing and say you're on your floods, your gaze goes to the mangroves and be like, oh, can we develop on this? But the question of can we sustainably develop or are there alternate ways is where the conversation, goes awry. And in terms of biodiversity, I think, especially in India, as Ganesh said, it's God for a lot of communities. I worked in communities in Goa and Karnataka, North Karnataka, where it's considered a sea turtle is considered a form of Vishnu. And around the turtle nesting beaches, we were seeing that there was this natural, obviously there are a lot of conflicts also on turtle nesting beaches, but the conservationists from the community were seeing it as a form of God that comes every year, like a homecoming and goes back. And during one of the public hearings in Goa, we were trying to see how we could give suggestions to make, turtle nesting beaches in terms of biodiversity protection stronger. And there was a government report itself, a CAG report, that said that the turtles provide ecosystem benefits in terms of maintaining the sand dunes. So the unfertilized eggs gives nutrition to the roots of, the Ipomia that grows on the sand dunes, which are creepers that grows on the sand dunes, that holds the sand. Which is why a lot of communities there survive Cyclone Tauktae, survive a lot of floods and erratic rainfall. And this season of turtle nesting happens only for 4 months, right? They come, so they get the nutrients from the deep sea to the shore. They take some nutrients from the shore to the deep sea. And it was fantastic that CAG report, which was an organization based in Delhi, could make the calculation and say the government would have to pay about 800 crores in making sea walls, which the turtle is doing for free, right? And all you need to do is probably look at it also from the aspect that it's not a helpless, non-human entity, but it's a very active stakeholder in your commons, right? So I think, just to answer your question from mangroves to also other ecosystems, policy does look at it, but policy also misses a lot of it out.
Right. So Ganesh, continuing on this particular aspect, how much of the fishermen communities kind of aware of the importance of some of these things like mangroves, or aware of the fact that how the climate is impacting the biodiversity, or how that is impacting their own work? How much awareness is there?
So the whole conversation when we started was these small fishing communities. Let's take example of Mumbai. I don't know, there are maybe 250 koliwadas in and around Mumbai, Thane, Raigad area. And those are all well protected by the mangroves. You go to any fishing village, there is always mangrove area there. So at least that has been protected. And if you go back like 100 years, what we were talking about, how the habitat has changed. All these creeks which goes hundreds of kilometers from Mumbai, Thane, Dharamtar, these are all flourished with, a lot of catch. And as soon as the industrialization, I don't want to name the MIDCs, but, the multiple MIDCs have set up just very near to these mangrove areas. And that is the main reason for, decline in the catch in the creeks. And as the creek started decline, most of these Kolivadas were dependent on the creeks and the mangroves to fishing in that neighborhood or habitat, and that has lost. And to give example, it can come back, let's say lockdown or COVID. There was a good gap of 6 months. The habitat did improve for that 6 months. There was no activity in those creeks, and we started, the tides coming in, fresh water started coming in. There was a good amount of crabs, prawns, and fish has been caught in those areas where those people have not seen fish for like 2 to 3 decades. And this we're talking about the coastal areas, but I have always been believer of, if a Kolivada is actively fishing in that area, the ocean stays protected and the mangroves can stay protected. So, I mean, the frontiers of the ocean or the creeks, they have to be placed there. Don't have to remove them from the coast. And that is the basic, What will a fisherman do without fishing in those areas? So, and in the deeper ocean, we had a conversation of, how climate will impact the habitats. It's happening with the small change. We see so many storms coming even on the west coast. Take example of this year. There have been 6 warnings of cyclones and bad weather, and that has impacted almost 30% of the fishing days. And if this continues, it impacts automatically on the economics of the fishing as well. The gone fishing days are not going to bring the good fish in the near days, because as the monsoon goes, winter starts, and the migration pattern starts, and the opportunity of catching fish goes. So that's the importance of the whole ecology and maintaining that, and that is what is first. I would say कि हमको ये सब दिख रहा है कि ये changes हो रहा है, and if इसके against policies नहीं है, and there is no fishing stakeholders on it, then it's going to collapse very soon.
It's very interesting to see the impact of COVID, the positive impact of COVID in some sense on mangroves. It basically says that how much human intervention is kind of damaging some of these ecosystems. But while mangroves are important and we all see them around, there are things that we don't know about our own waters. And that is the presence of hunchback dolphins and finless porpoises, on which Shaunak here works. He has a project running on those. And Shaunak, your views on what are the stress points or the factors that affect these species, because they're already endangered, and I'm sure these changes are going to make them even more vulnerable now.
Yes, so we have 2 species of coastal cetaceans in our waters. They are the Indian Ocean humpback dolphins and the Indo-Pacific finless porpoises. They're both obligate nearshore species, which means that they inhabit only, say, about up to a depth of 20 meters from shore, which in Mumbai is not too much. Maybe between 7 and 10 kilometers is where they live. And I think the biggest threat to them today is water quality. Of course, it's a much larger threat of habitat degradation and habitat loss, but when I then go down a level, it's water quality. I don't know how many people here know, but Mumbai releases 2.8 billion liters of sewage every day. And 50% of that, and 50% is the official figure, is untreated. That is the state of our coastal waters. Now, it's not just affecting the dolphins, it's affecting everything and everyone who make use of those waters. Right from the fish, crabs, all of the marine life that inhabits it, then of course the dolphins and the predators, and also the humans who depend on the fish that are caught in those waters. It's a health hazard across species. Water quality, I think, is the biggest one. And the second, of course, is the unmitigated development that's happening. We've seen the coastal road come up in the last 5 years. We are now seeing the Bandra-Warsaw Sea Link, which is now in different forms being extended all the way to Vasai, if I'm not mistaken. And when you look at the environmental impact assessment of projects like this, if you look at the biodiversity section, it's probably 1 page, right? There's a lot of focus on mangroves. How many mangroves are being cut? What is the mangrove loss? We need to look beyond mangroves. If you're reclaiming land, then there are two other types of habitats that are completely ignored, both as habitats, as fishing grounds, as just places of extremely diverse biodiversity. If you're looking at making a sea bridge, how that bridge is going to impact the subtidal regions, we don't know. Those studies aren't being done. So everything, of course, for us, the dolphins are like a flagship and a keystone species. But to say that something, when the impact of something negatively reaches the dolphin, that means there's a whole lot that under them that's also being negatively impacted. And us humans as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so following up on that, Sarita, I mean, there are no policies for sewage water and release of it. What?
Of course, there are. There are policies for everything. Yeah. So when I remember, I think when Shaunak and I, were pre-COVID working on something, the coastal road. We were looking at sewage, discharge, and everything. And I was like, why are there no policies? Like, what is the BMC doing? Fast forward to now, where I work in the state level, of course, not with the BMC, but we interact with the BMC too. I started speaking to them to understand what exactly is going on. Like, do they not have policies? And one of my classmates in my master's program, he had joined when he was already like AMC, Assistant Municipal Commissioner. He's the sewage waste management deputy commissioner now. So I went and asked him, what's up, why are we not doing enough? And he said, Sarita, 50% of the city lives in informal housing, right? We don't know where to start with. And the remaining 50% obviously live in informal housing, but also that also comes in somewhat of an informal bracket because it's not regulated very well. So one, should the sewage, solid waste management department be monitoring the sewage, or should it be like UHD, which is urban, development and housing development? And should we be speaking to each other, which we are not, right? And when you look at it from there, like, can one bureaucrat or can one department even take on this challenge? The answer is a very glaring no. Second thing is, it's not a priority, even for people, because they don't know that this is an issue, that your untreated sewage that you flush is actually just being released into the Arabian Sea. A lot of us think that, oh, we live in a very nice society, we are paying good maintenance. Of course, it's being treated somewhere. Most of the time it's not. It's being released into the sea or somewhere in some habitat. And because of this ignorance of data, I think it's also not a priority when it comes to policy or politics, I might add. So yeah, the government and how the government functions is a reflection of society, as one of my mentors in the government says, to some extent, that if the people don't find this a priority, the government is also not going to find this to be a priority.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, implementation and compliance is one aspect, and as you pointed out, there are gaps in the governance itself. But rather more specific question is that, how are these affecting marine or intertidal ecosystems? Any specific examples that you have?
The first time I went to meet some fishing communities in Versova, again, this was 2018, 2019, before COVID. And they told me, just wait at the jetty area, we'll come there. I was like, okay, cool, jetty, and I think I've not visited Versova in forever, like the jetty area. I visited cafes and everything growing up, but nobody goes to inside the Kolivara to the jetties. So I went all the way there and I was waiting, and I think it was high tide, I'm guessing, or the tide was a little high. And I seen a sea of plastic. I couldn't see the water, to start off with. It was oil, it was plastic, there were boats and that, there were boats parked there, and it was submerged. And I took a couple of pictures and everything. And I couldn't imagine how are people living around this ecosystem, let alone biodiversity, right? I cannot speak for biodiversity, to be very fair here. I think we should let biodiversity speak for itself if we want to listen to it. That is, if you go and document, say, dolphins or sea turtles or corals or non-important species as per policy. So as per the Wildlife Protection Act, they have Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4. And the Schedule 1s are the tigers, or the corals, are the dolphins. I guess it's a Schedule 1 species. But there are also the other species like, I remember at my first show walk was with Shaunak itself, and there was something called Nerita and snails, sea snails, and sponges, which are not covered anywhere, or it's in the Schedule 4, which is basically considered grass, I think, in like governance and implementation, from a governance and implementation perspective. That it's there on a list, but it's not really important. So I think once we also look at policy to not, give importance to of Schedule 1 only, and also kind of regulate, maybe a Schedule 4 could become a Schedule 1 and it does not need only an IUCN red list. Probably it could be like a local biodiversity survey, and you can kind of determine what are your endangered species in your region. It does not have to wait for a global list to come and tell you it's now in the red zone, so now you need to go and protect, your sponges or, your crabs. Right? So something like that needs to be more community-centric, more community-owned, I feel. And because of that gap where I don't even know, didn't even know that there were so many species of crabs, and there were corals on our coast until 2019, living in Mumbai, growing up in Mumbai, having a family that comes from seafarers and also a lineage of fishers. I had no idea that there were corals here. So I think, just to put it very briefly, yeah.
Yeah. So Ganesh, something that's in your bio sketch that I received, that you're a seventh generation of fishermen. I'm sure you, your parents, and your grandparents must have kind of experienced the change over time. You must have heard the stories from them. And you basically told a little bit about, about the catch and how there is an impact on the catch itself. But when it comes to the species that you have now versus the species that your parents that, caught, is there a major shift? What is the impact there?
There is a major shift, and what I've heard from stories from my grandfather, and of course, I was also 12-year-old when I went first time in the fishing. It was 2000 November, Diwali holidays. Just 12-year-old thought of going fishing, and I'll come back in 1 or 2 days. And even that day, I took 10 days to come back. On my 15-meter boat, went for a fishing, and that was the first time I experienced dolphins and whale, blue whale, and turtles and everything. And just to add on that point, I think as a community, we have always been protecting the marine species. And that is the reason, we call them Dev. Be it shark whale, we call it Bhairi Dev. Be it a turtle, we call it Kasav Dev. We call it a blue whale, we call it Dev Masa. And I think that has been there in the community for a very, very long time, what to catch, what to not catch, and the seasonal catch, of course. But I think the major challenge has been the climate and, the whole urbanization. And within the community also, the challenges of, having too many people catching the same amount of fish over the years and years. So that is also the problem we have not talked about a lot in the community as well. Whereas my father and there were only 5 people fishing for the same quantity of fish. Now there are 10 people catching the same amount of fish. And that is why we see this so much of struggle and overfishing and all that talkings. But yes, talking about marine conservation and those species, they have disappeared. In Mumbai region and around, if you go like 20-25 kilometers away also, like from Alibag to Thane region, there were spottings before of, blue whales and the other different humpback whale and so on. But last 15-20 years, we don't hear the stories from the fishermen because we being at the harbor and, we always get that story. There was a sighting and all. So that sighting has stopped, to be honest. And on to the local level, the domestic level, what the pollution we've been talking about, it's massive. As I earlier told, if you give a break to the environment, it does come back. But the impact what has created on the ground of Mumbai, in the seabed, when I talk about, forget what you see in the floating on the sea and all. If you put an anchor in the seabed, there's almost every time you get like 2 to 3 feet of plastic being, dumped and you see that anchor pulling up all that plastic. So that is the problem we have created for so many years. And because of that, the lobsters, the prawns and other crustaceans, which used to be the 70% of the catch, there is a study from CMFRI in the 1970s and 80s, 70% of the Mumbai catch, Maharashtra catch in fact, was in and around Mumbai. And that has completely declined, And because of the people are not fishing in these creeks and there is no catch in this, people have only the main harbors like Kulaba, Sasundog, big harbors like Ferry Wharf, and where the access is, where you can go to deeper oceans and you can take big boats and catch fish. It has been there. But over there also there is a similar problem. I mean, the catches are declining. Some species of demersal catch, I would say, people will not know, like repti, it's called soulfish, then sand lobster, which were in abundance in before, but those species have just gone. We don't catch them anymore.
Right. I mean, to kind of circumvent some of these consequences that we are seeing, I think it's engagement of the community becomes important, and all three of you have been kind of trying to engage with the communities. And in a different context, and so Shaunak, you have been actually engaging with citizens of Mumbai and trying to kind of make them aware of the consequences of shrinking marine spaces. So what has been your experience with these engagements, and how has this impacted? I mean, is there an impact? Are the behaviors of the citizens changing, their view towards ocean, sea? Is there any change there? Yeah.
So we started Marine Life of Mumbai in 2017, and we've been doing shore walks, which are basically nature trails that we conduct at low tide. And we just take a group of people with us to show everything that's found in the intertidal zone on different shores across Mumbai. Now, when we started documenting, we ourselves realized that we don't know what we are finding. We don't know what species there are. There are barely any historical records from Mumbai. So we started documenting it. And then we realized that more people need to see. In fact, Mr. Pradeep Patade, he's here. He's one of the co-founders of Marine Life of Mumbai. And he has been documenting marine life since 2013. So he started Marine Life of Mumbai in 2017. And since then, we've been able to show about 10 to 15,000 people maybe, the marine life that's found here over the years. But it's a small dent, right? It's a huge city. We don't have the kind of mediums to reach the kind of people who need to know about these ecosystems, about these animals. It's extremely important, because if you don't know that something exists, you will not do anything to protect it, right? Or for that matter, like Sarita brought up a very important point about if it's not going to be important to the voter, it's not going to be important to the politicians. And we saw this happening when she spoke about it in 2019. There were two cases in the court in Mumbai. One was against the construction of the coastal road, and one was against the construction of the metro shed in RA. And we saw the kind of response that RA generated. There was a familiarity that people had with forests, with animals, with leopards that inhabit those forests. But there were maybe 100 or 150 people, the small group of us, who were saying that, the coastal road is going to cause a lot of ecological damage. And even within those 150, there were differing opinions, some saying that the road is not needed, some saying that a lesser damaging way of constructing the road is needed. But that again brings me to what I was trying to say is that 150 people, that's the extent of who really wanted to speak up for the marine life and the sea. And I think that's extremely sad for a coastal city like Mumbai, who, the first thing that we're taught in schools is that Mumbai was 7 islands that became one, right? So our relationship with the sea is so integral. The identity of the city with the sea is so integral, yet it remains invisible to the majority of the people living here. Our beaches are commons, they are used by millions every day, but they are not looked at as a habitat. And that is what we're trying to break. And I think citizen science, by the way that we are trying to reach people, is a small step in that. But of course, there need to be a lot more people doing what we are doing. But it's at least the first step.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point that you raised, one needs to strike the balance between development and conservation and how to do that. We'll come to that in a while, but before we go there, I think we'll finish the community conversation. And both Sarita and Ganesh have been actually working with fishermen who are actually the major stakeholders here. And Sarita, you have been a vocal advocate of, involvement of fishermen in the climate discussions and coastal dialogues. So how do you kind of envision this community-centered or controlled model of coastal governance? And how would it look like? And I said this as a community-centered, but it can also be community-controlled in some sense. And what is better, whether it's centered or controlled, that is?
Good question. Just a small correction that I used to work with fish workers, which include fishermen and fisherwomen. And 50% of that labor force is women, right? I used to work with the National Fish Workers Forum. I'm still affiliated with the union. It's a national union of all, it's a federation of all state level unions. Ganesh, I'm sure must be also part and parcel of the state activities. And when I joined, I thought, this is a confederation of small-scale fish workers. I will learn a lot about, policy, but also community needs and everything. And yes, to an extent, it did expose, a lot of these issues. And should the community be owning the coast, or should it be a commons for everyone? Within NFF, I know they were looking at something very similar to the Forest Rights Act, right? They were like, say, Forest Rights Act, it's so easy, it's to understand for a layman that there are indigenous people, they should be, managing and governing their forest. Why is the same kind of sentiment not available to the coast, right? Shouldn't the indigenous people of the shore be managing, the coast? And then for some years, I was like, yeah, okay, there is merit to your argument, but what about non-indigenous people who also want to access the shore, right? Are they stakeholders? Are they not stakeholders? I think it depends in the region and the context, to be honest. As I say this in probably all my lectures, there's no one size fits all. And for a city like Mumbai that also uses the coast, right? As you mentioned, within a coastal road, the sentiment of minus 150 versus the rest of the population was that we are spending 4 hours in traffic to commute from Borivali to Churchgate, right? And this is this grand vision where you're going to make a magical road that's going to suddenly, hyperloop us in probably 1-2 hours. And that's what connected with a lot of people. Like, I got a lot of backlash from my own family. Forget about society and, people at large. That how can you be against something so dire and so needed? That's where I think, the community-owned versus community-governed question comes into play, right? And I think the coastal commons is something that the bulk of the city looks as either as something that you would not go towards, like a Marve beach, where I would not think of spending my Sunday, in that space, because I know that there's no place for recreation. It's not a Baga's like Marve now. It's not a Kolva beach, where I can go for a dip, swim and come back. It's something that is very triggering, right? So this is the relationships, like that commons is either something that needs to be stayed away from, or you have that sentiment that anywhere it's like something of a wasteland. Nobody is doing anything because you don't see the fishers every day. They're coming in the morning or they're coming, late in the evening, on the afternoon. You don't see them all the time. And they also are a community that we have, and I'll bring a little bit of caste and class here. We have kind of isolated from the city. The Koliwadas are not integrated within our residential areas, right? They are called Koliwadas. There's a demarcated space on the shores, that they live in. In the current CRZ 2019, the Coastal Regulation Zone, the new policy was released in 2019. Koliwadas are now in the same list as slums. So any development will be termed for them in terms of the slum rehabilitation, schemes in SRAs. In the 2011, it wasn't that. In the 2011, they recognized that, Koliwadas had customary rights, and Koliwadas across the country, like different versions of them. And this shift from like, oh, this is a place of indigenous people, of traditional people that should be protected, to like, oh, these people are in dire need of development, that commons needs to have a road, or we need to exploit it for like the greater good. I think that narrative really, brings the question into pictures who the community is and should they be controlling it or managing it. And in a city like Mumbai, I really wish the indigenous people probably controlled the coast, because at least we would have maybe a lot of, the wild coastline still with us if it was controlled by them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the point that you raised, that the Koli community is kind of isolated, and Ganesh, I mean, you have been actually, the community has a voice when it's empowered. And you have been working in this particular domain since quite some time, giving them, introducing them to the modern technology, improving their access to market, etc., etc. I mean, how has this helped? That's the first question. And how do you manage to integrate this with the traditional knowledge that the community has?
See, I'll go back to what Sarita was mentioning, that coastal road was made, almost 100 kilometers of a coastline, 100 fishing, Koliwadas, or landing centers, I will call, they go morning fishing or a couple of days fishing, come back. That was the whole point of discussion when there used to be a stakeholders meeting. Even I used to be part of it, and today I regret it that we were not opposite, to be honest. I am the person, who go and first use it now. I'm sure all of you are using as well. The whole point was, when you are putting so much of crores to build a 6-lane road, there are like 12 fishing Koliwadas with the fish landing centers, Mahim, Worli, Kafred, Marine Drive also, and up to Warsaw. Why not integrate them with the road and have a small landing centers or jetties and a small infrastructure when 100 boats can be parked? That was the whole point what we were asking. There was no transparency of, whether the bridge was going to be on the pillars or they were going to reclaim the sea, and, there was no access to the sea. I'm not going to put my boat on my shoulder and, walk that distance of 500 meters and go back into the fishing, That's the whole point of, having a stakeholders meeting and designing the bridge. So I think that's the whole concept of, integrating community along the Mumbai coastline has lost. And that is why there was no future, to even discuss that. Because now everybody wants, and community being such a small marginalized community and having no vote bank politics, we don't have a voice. And that is where, when I had a voice or my community had a voice, we realized that, what is the power of your vote in your own politics. And that is why we asked, a small example I'll give, from 2015, we asked for an infrastructure to come out of the Sassoon-Dock. The fear was the same thing, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather have been operating in Colaba Sassoon-Dock for 100 years. What if even that is lost? So we, as a community from Karanja, came together, asked for a new harbor. We got a new harbor. Now we have a new hope. And that is what was needed in Mumbai as well, with all the Koliwadas coming together, with the citizens also of Mumbai, and giving them the infrastructure which have been used along with the coastal road. That is what it is. And going forward, what we were talking about declining species and how tech can integrate with the species. That is what Blue Catch, as a small startup, last 3-4 years I was in Bangalore also working with multiple startups to bringing on technology onto the smaller communities or species which are high value or commercially important. So now we have come to the point that we can't do fishing every day, and it can be economical because the cost is so high. So it is all about adaptation, and what to catch, how to catch, and how to market it. And in fact, last 2-3 months also, there's another initiative what we are working on. It's an impact campaign with a lot of chefs in the city and other loca where a Thomas chef is there. We are trying to integrate small fishermen from Mumbai, to create a supply chain. They sell fish directly to the hotelers or the caterings or even the good retailers or the big hotels. So these are all small campaigns or pilot projects what we are trying to create. And with the help of tech, what has been available, what's like Sarita was mentioning, what has been caught is not been recorded. So going forward, next 2 decades, you could say, who are actively engaged in fishing. As a tech, it is very much important now to bring that financial stability in the fisherman, because nobody knows how he's a smaller fisherman or middle fisherman, how much he catch, what is the size of his boats. So with the help of tech integration, even the government policies are helping now. There's a platform called NFDB, where everything is becoming digital now. You can log your catch and you can find your buyers. So these small things are happening. And on a larger scale, what majorly has to be happen is if we have some species, which can have a, let's say, identity, like Bombay as a Bombay duck, Goa as a mackerel, even Ratnagiri as a mackerel, entire West Coast as a calamari. So tech can bring that species onto a global buyer platform. So that is what a tech integration, what we're trying to do. A small example I can give it to understand it, because everybody knows, who want to have coffee, you want to know where the coffee is coming from. Similarly, if as a Mumbai fisherman I'm catching fish, I want to know that, okay, he's a Bombay fisherman catching mackerel or squid, something like that.
Right, interesting. So again, coming back to this aspect that we briefly discussed about the how to, balance the, development and the conservation at the same time. And here the policies become important. And not just making the policies, but also implementing them, the compliance. And when it comes to oceans or seas, these are open spaces. I mean, it may not be that easy to even if you implement, the compliance does become kind of an issue. So Shaunak, is there a governance model which kind of offers a promising lesson to safeguard coastal ecosystems?
There is no protection to coastal ecosystems, like you said. And it's so different that some practices that happen here may not happen 100 kilometers later, or maybe even 50 kilometers later. So here, what is most important is, one is the acknowledgement of our coastal waters and coastlines as habitats, as important biodiversity ecosystems. Once that is done, that is established, we need baseline studies. Once that is done, we need to bring in different communities that live along those coastlines. And a model that I'm really and this is my personal opinion, that I'm really fond of, and I find that can be very effective if done properly, is a community managed area. It does not need protection from, say, in our work, it's often assumed that it's biodiversity versus fisheries. That is not always the case. Fishers know much more than us researchers do. We are always looking at them for knowledge of different kinds. Like Ganesh said, they look at biodiversity not only as a means of livelihood, but it holds tremendous cultural significance to the community. And they also worship animals. Now, we could learn a thing or two from that, right? If there is a community who is so attuned to the movements of the sea, why not get them to manage those areas? But again, and this may not be practical from a governance point of view, but these solutions need to be looked at locally. There is, Sarita said, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for this. Because fisheries, coastal areas, coastal communities, they vary, like I said, probably even 100 kilometers from here, practices could be completely different. But for a large part of India's coastline, community managed areas could be something that I think has tremendous potential if done bottom up, not top down. Here, a lot of policies are made in the center, they're put into states, and then the state government just implements them without real knowledge of consequence on the people who are affected by it, or by the biodiversity that's affected by it. I think we need to now focus bottom up and look at solutions that way.
Yeah. Now, since the time is running out, I think, Sarita, your views on, I mean, there's one policy or regulatory reform that you can think of which will strengthen India's coastline. What would that be?
I think implementing the existing ones first.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, we have too many policies. Now in the climate space also, just briefly, we have a lot of climate action plans at a city level, at a district level, and it's just plans and more plans and more plans. Some of them now I am planning with. But the implementation of plans and policies, I think, is where we need to move towards. There is a coastal regulation zone. I fell in love with that policy in 2017 because, and this is maybe a takeaway for the audience, to please download the CRZ 2011, not the 19, the 2011 notification, and just read the first few pages. And it's a love story to the coast, you know. The way it speaks in paralegal language about protecting the shore, the entire country's shore, is something that got me hooked. And then you go more into the policy and be like, oh, okay, everything is a permissible activity suddenly. But yeah, I think implementing and strengthening existing policies is the way to go.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. So Ganesh, you already pointed out that the Koli community looks at fish and diversity in general with huge respect. I mean, they have this, innate understanding of these things. But at the same time, I mean, are there structural reforms that are important wherein one can, protect the ecosystem, but while doing that, you also have economic stability for Koli community?
I think there are too many policies to protect and stop us from fishing, to be honest. And all the fines are limited to, and the regulations also are limited to fishermen. Nothing happens after that. So the supply chain and the stakeholder is never the part of the policy. I think that is because in a fishing industry, it's only not who catches the fish is important, but who consumes is also important, or who process is also important. I think that one part of thing is lacking in the policy for so many years. And in fact, now recently one new policy has come, and on that, that is protecting the rights of fishermen. The major stakeholders are also a part of policy. But having a fair trade and, economically surviving this for a longer period, I think we need more pilot projects to, happen. Not across the coast, but, adopting one or two villages and making a success story out of it. That is one thing I would want. And of course, there is a lack of awareness of the biodiversity or the species itself, what fishes should be consumed and what fishes should be caught. And that will start from the consumer, and I think that is what is lacking in our market at least, and that is why we are so much dependent on the export market or the other states, and there is hardly any local consumption happening. So I think going forward, if we can create a massive campaign, a more impact campaign where we can have awareness of what is being caught locally and, support the community, that can help in a much longer period, yeah.
Yeah. So, Shaunuk, quick thoughts on how to build a marine conscious citizens.
I just hope that going forward it's taught in schools. We need kids to look at marine life from an Indian context. We need to use the words blue whale and Maharashtra in one sentence because they are here, right? We need to use dolphins and Mumbai in one sentence. We have 5 species of sea turtles in Maharashtra. I know that we have at least 3 or 4 species of cetaceans in Maharashtra, but there is such little information out there, right? We need many more organizations doing the work that we want to do to get this out to the people. There's only so much 1 or 2 or 5 organizations can do. And I think schools, of course, is something that I really look forward to doing with our work also. Outreach in schools, I think that's a fantastic way to do it. And also be more conscious of where you're living. It's only when you go to a place that's better than the place you live at, do you realize that things can be different, right? I had that realization only when I stopped looking at the beach as a venue for beach cleanups. I realized it's an ecosystem also. It's much more. And I think we just need to be more aware as citizens about what we have and what we are on the verge of losing. But again, there's too much messaging on negatives, so I'll just concentrate on the positives and say there's an octopus in Mumbai that's waiting for you to see it. So please go explore the shores.
Yeah, I think this is the right time to take a few questions from the audience.
My name is Anand, and thank you for this great panel. So my question is on the practical side. We have industry. If for 40 years, 45 years, I've been going to Pune, not now, but when I was a schoolboy in the holidays, and that Ullas River was purple. Right? I don't know how it is now. So we have industry, which is Gabbar, and nowadays we have real estate, which is Darth Vader. So either bring them into the fold or spank them, punish them somehow, and better to bring them into the fold. How could that be done? How could they be encouraged to modify practices or completely change if possible?
I mean, there is an obvious answer. And there's also a not obvious answer. The obvious answer is that we hear in speeches and among, conversations that of course development is important. Of course jobs are important. How can we just do away with things? And also it's like, then how do they develop, right? So let me take you to the process of an EIA for an industry. Is on a coast, say not Ulhas, but any estuary like, into the sea. That's also covered under the EIA framework. So you have to assess the ecosystem, the species, the land use, everything. And it's often given to a third-party consulting organization. It's not done by the government, okay, for this industry. This is a consultant that does not have access to data. So I don't know how many whale sharks are probably there because I'm not a government, I'm in a consulting firm, right? And then, the government department, like say my department that I consult with right now, also does not have that data. So the thing is this, when you take it to a broader level in terms of industrial development, of course you're like, there's nothing there. So industry bana lete hai, right? So I think, again, the narrative, is to which should we join them or should we exclude them? And I think there's no correct answer, to be honest, because there are very stubborn industries also that we deal with, right? I work in my department, like my cell is placed in the MPCB office, and I see like different versions of industrial owners or their legal teams coming and fighting with MPCB. So it really depends, like, if it's a stubborn industrialist that, is like, my way or the highway, then yeah, obviously, there are different ways you have to deal with it. But there are industries that also want to adapt, because when you go to COPs or when there's World Environment Day, suddenly everybody's like, oh my God, this industrialist has, ruined this environment and this industry is ruining the environment. So they are also pretty aware that, these narratives and the limit of greenwashing is also reaching a threshold.
So I would like to ask, before any construction project is being carried out, an EIA is conducted. So have you come across a case study where the diversity of that specific zone has been intentionally downplayed so that the project could give a green access? That's my question.
Yeah, this was before this job. I was working with a legal team to basically look at protecting a turtle nesting beach in North Karnataka, near Karwar area. And it was a very evident turtle nesting beach. Like, the turtles were coming, the fishers were protecting, the forest department boards, everything was there. And a small port was, scheduled to come there by a private company in Hyderabad. And in the EIA report, when we were reading it, they said, firstly, there are no turtles. Okay, they just put a blanket statement, which was accepted by the KCZMA, I might say. And the forest department, when we went to them, they were like, oh, we did not see this part of the EIA, we did not read it. It went into revision. We got another copy of it. And then they said, we'll build underpasses so the turtles can pass through the bridge and do the nesting and then come out. Right? So yes, we have seen multiple case studies in multiple regions. This is an example, in another state. But again, it comes to the awareness of can turtles actually go under an underpass? Because whoever thought of that and thought of putting it in the EIA was so creative and so confident that yes, they were like 100% olive ridley sea turtles will walk on a concrete, part of the beach and go towards an underpass nest. And because olive ridleys obviously can read Google Maps and signboards, that's a turtle underpass, right? So yes, we have come across very creative crazies, I might say, and we try to deal with it in the best way possible.
To just give you another perspective on this, with marine life especially and ocean ecosystems, there is no data. Our organization is a team of 6 people, and we are doing baseline studies in Mumbai, in one of the largest cities in the country, one of the richest cities in the country. We are doing the work that government organizations are supposed to do. So when it comes to marine biodiversity specifically, there is very little data out there besides fisheries. Fisheries, they will tell you the last bit of data about every species also that's being caught. But beyond that, there's very little to go by. So when consultants make these reports and they don't have any published literature, they say there is no biodiversity. Now, to counter that, what we did was, we have a data set of about 14,000 observations from Mumbai with over 600 species from our shores. And we've made that open access. Anybody from any private company to a government organization to a researcher to a student can make use of our data in any way they want. And I think models like this need to be replicated in multiple places, not by us, by other people, so that we can fill this really important data gap. Because whether you talk about dolphins, whales, turtles, or the smallest sea slug or a snail, India has a huge data gap that needs to be filled. I think that's a very important thing to also keep in mind with regards to EIAs.
Hi, my name is Anisha Sangani and I'm a US-based mixed media artist. So I understand that art cannot fix problems, but my goal has been to raise awareness through my art, and my art is created for ocean conservation. So what do you think I can do to help the cause?
I think there's tremendous impact that art can have. And yeah, I mean, if there's anything that you require from us or from anyone else here, I'm pretty sure we would all be very happy to guide you or help you with what you require. But yes, we can always discuss later how we can do something together.
Yeah, and just show the reality, I think, through a creative medium, Don't beautify it. Because the realities need to be shown, and I think art is the best medium because clearly policy, court cases, legal reports don't work. Probably art works, so yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for this panel, although I was pretty late for this. But I'm so glad to just see the panel that there is a consultant, there's an academician, and then there are people who have been actively, trying to work their part in awareness. And that brings me to my question. Of course, I want to ask a question that follows the previous two questions, is that why do we see absence of evidence as evidence of absence? Why don't we start with ki kuch to hoga? There's always something there. Why do we say ki, oh, there's no evidence, so there must be nothing? Nobody's worked on it, so I'm sure it's like an empty, space of vacuum. Because we all know that, we live in a land of rich biodiversity. And I don't think we are at a stage, at least in today's day and time of social media and the kind of exposure everyone has, that, where we are collectively heading as a society, and especially people in Bombay and Delhi and all the metros. So my question is that how do we essentially change this environmental philosophy that kind of helps us navigate through all of these questions and perhaps create a space for stakeholders to talk to each other? And then, of course, my second question is that why, because I work in the field of forest products, we don't identify these ecosystems as forests. And these are pristine, unless and until there's a tree planted over there, we don't see any space as a forest. So is this a narrative that can be explored? So yeah, thank you.
Maybe I'll answer the first part of your question. You know, when policy is made without understanding what is this policy, and it's policy for everyone, right? It's public policy. For example, if all of y'all, before y'all entered the hall, were just asked to deposit all your phones, probably your shoes, you know, outside. And the standard answer that any of the organized would give you, it's policy. It says, though it says. And I think conservation, especially coming to biodiversity, has been in a very restrictive form of policy. Obviously, like it has its merits that, you know, there was a lot of, trafficking of animals and abuse of forests and wildlife and everything. Yes, but it was restrictive to like the violators. But it now applies to certainly everyone, right? If I take a Schedule 1 species photo and I go and publish it somewhere, like I'm very sure like if some forest department officer has some grudge with me, he'll be like, Schedule 1, I can fine you. Where did you see it? You know? There's a restrictive policy in place. So I think when you don't explain, restrictive policies or the manner of such policy which affects everyone, like say the coast is a commons and you make a CRZ which just says 500 meters, no development zone, buffer. Why, who, what, you know, yes, sounds good, but for who, for what, for why? From high tide line to 12 nautical miles is CRZ 4, do what you want to do there. You know, after the 500, what happened to the ocean? Like nobody's explaining anything to me, but I'm like, okay, I cannot like use this, but I can use that. So I think this gatekeeping of why am I bringing a policy, what is the ethos and reasons of it, and kind of gatekeeping that information, you know, from the general public is I think why we look at it from like now when there's no policy, do what you wish, or you know, we're going to fight against this policy. We're not going to keep our shoes and phones out. We're going to get it in. That's the narrative in which it usually goes when it comes to narratives towards environmental policies.
I mean, I'm really glad that this discussion has ignited many conversations, but I guess we have to end the session soon. And I think those who have additional questions, we can stay back and have a more kind of a closed conversation a little later. So, yeah, Asad.
Thank you for such a rich and thought-provoking discussion. You know, I am just going to add a few things. Shaunak, you mentioned about the schools, and that adds to the US-based artist question. You know, Avid had conceptualized and presented a book called Coral Woman. It was on coral conservation that I got HarperCollins to publish. And it was all about getting students to kids to get ownership. They created the corals, they created the woman. We created this book and we distributed it around the world. So next time your octopus is in a place where, you know, you need a little help, you call us. And our next session for Avid is going to be at Serendipity Arts Festival in Goa. And and Ganesh mentioned Chef Tizak. So we're going to be talking to him about coastal cuisines and looking at sustainability and looking at how, because of climate change, what is happening to our culinary lineage. And, also, you know, you mentioned COP. I have another thought on that, but I'm not going to go there. But I just need to do a lot of thank yous. Thank you to our panelists, Sarita, Shaunak, and Ganesh, and Dr. Sounmane for so skillfully moderating this conversation. And especially to our collaborators, Professor Chengaluru and Professor Vaidya for always being so generous and welcoming us back here. It's always such a pleasure to work with you and your teams. And to our other collaborators, Ms. Nidhi Chaudhary, Director of NGMA, Shishir Joshi, Chief Executive and Founder Trustee of Project Mumbai. And to you, our audiences, I know this is an early time and a work day, and to making the time to be here, we really appreciate it. This collaboration between AVID, TIFR, and the NGMA will be presenting 3 more programs leading up to Mumbai Climate Week. I'm not going to bore you with details. It will be on all our websites and all our social media handles. So do check it out. It starts in January and ends in Feb. And we have also many more interesting, another thing we're doing actually at the Conscious Collective on Saturday is looking at sustainable building practices and using local materials. And so hopefully the turtles would have, found a better way to get to their water or their nesting. But on that note, thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.